that the name itself would suggest mining activity, and this is very accurate. Although the word itself, Silvermines, is a latter word of around the 1700s, so that the Irish version, or the Irish name, would be Béla Hagaon, which again is aligned with the artisanship and with mining, I suppose. The mouth of the ford of the smith, Gawa meaning the word smith. So that would suggest that there was always an association with mining here. Now, recorded mining only started in 1289. This is the first mention we have, and this ties in well with the political situation when the Normans came to Ireland in the 12th century, and they came to Tipperary under the great family name of the Butler, and it was in this part of the world in Nina that the Butler family was founded. They built that beautiful castle in Nina around 1200 to 1220, and they began to develop themselves, and then of course subsequently they moved to Garn and they moved to Kilkenny, and they became an incredibly mighty force throughout Ireland. But the Butler family per se, of French origin of course, they came here to Nina in the 13th century. And the association with mining would suggest that entrepreneurs, or miners if you wish, or merchants, came here from northern Italy in 1289. They came from Genoa and from Florence, and obviously they came as speculators. And in each successive generation then we've had mining of some sort. Sometimes it was influenced by the presence of the Lord, in particular Lord Denali, who was a Cromwellian planter here in the 1600s, and he set up base here originally at Dunail, which is from which he took the name subsequently Dunalley. Dun meaning the fort and Isle meaning the cliff, and this castle, which had been at Garryard, had been built as an O'Kennedy castle. So in advance of all of that, of course, the area around here is essentially O'Kennedy country, and up to 36 or 38% of the land was held here by the O'Kennedys before the arrival of the Cromwells. So there was a huge transformation then when the O'Kennedys fell out of favour and lost a lot of their land and were replaced by the Cromwellian planter. And the landlords brought their own ideas, of course. For instance, the village of Silvermines is a very much typically a planned village. It has all the ingredients of early 19th century, like Main Street, the church and schools and Garda station and a creamery and smithy and all of these things, including a fair green. So it was a nice composite village in the early 19th century and throughout the 19th century, and of course up to the present day. So, and we see this very much in evidence still. It was planned, so it was laid out pretty attractively. And then of course Lord Denali himself built a mansion for himself in the 1770s at Kilboy, which is a little east of the village, about between Dalla and Silvermines. And he lived there until the 1960s. The General Mining Company of Ireland came here and mined extensively, and they had a nice motto which stated, "Employ the people, enrich yourselves," which they took seriously, I'm sure. And it's because of the richness of the ore in the area. I should say that the so-called Silvermines Fault, in geological terms, stretches from the village westwards to Shilley. Over in Shilley there was extensive mining, principally for copper and so forth. And the mining then was sporadic in places, but it was at all times intensive. And it's recorded even that during the 1846 the miners were being paid by corn rather than by money, which suggested at least that they were able to survive. So and we have evidence, of course, of the 19th century mining here, evidence in the form of wonderful engine houses that were built. These were beam engines. They represented a quantum leap in mining terms, because for the first time now steam was being used to assist in the mining, principally in terms of pumping water and crushing ore as well. And happily in the Silvermines area now we have 3 engine houses that are conserved and illustrate the type of work that was done after the 1860s. And we may well have had 10 or 20 of those, because they were very common. They existed really since the 1700s, but they were perfected then in latter years by Cornish engineers, so we call them Cornish engines. And happily we have 3 of them here. In 2008, 3 of them were funded by Interreg, European Interreg program, in association with the rehabilitation program here. 3 of them got attention, and they are now conserved, and they now serve as visitor attractions or tourist attractions in their own right. And then, of course, up about 1875, then, due to the economic situation or whatever, perhaps scarcity of ore, perhaps linked with labour, access to labour or access to the ore itself. But mining ceased here in Silvermines anyhow at about 1875, and all the plants were closed down. So there was a great silence then, if you like, between 1875 and for 3/4 of a century in 1950. Although war times seems to spur mining very much worldwide, and in 1918 here we had some mining development and mining interest, but we have no evidence of the buildings being built. But that's because it coincided with the 1914-1918 war. Obviously metal became important, and Silvermines was revisited for a short period, but essentially nothing happened until 1950, when the Silvermines Lead and Zinc Company was formed. And this was probably the first time in history that essentially an Irish company was set up to mine the area. And they had a twin project going, one at Silvermines and one west of here at Tralee. The Silvermines plant was designed to process the ore residue from the 1800s, 19th century. And tons of that were processed in special buildings that were built called the Wales plant. It was a German pilot scheme, and they built these large buildings, which are still in evidence, in 1950 as a pilot scheme. But sadly, economically, it wasn't very successful. The lead mine was progressing in Tralee, and they worked around the clock in Tralee, produced mining lead, revisiting, if you wish, many of the works of the 1800s. And this would not be unusual in mining, because mining is very transient and it's very temporary, and it's dictated, economics of it are dictated to by war situations, the demand for ore, access to the ore itself, technology of course, and labour costs. And all of these things were a feature in Tralee. But that mine ran sporadically, because during the Korean War as well, influenced by the Korean War, it ran from 1950 until January 1958, when it closed. It produced about 350,000 tonnes of lead, which at that time was sizable. But the net result was that it was a loss-making venture, and there were hundreds of thousands in debt when the mine closed in 1958. The Tralee site itself, as we talk in current day terms from a tourism point of view, has all the ingredients of attractiveness. Firstly, that site itself is attractive because of its location. And everywhere you stir in, everywhere you look, you see some evidence of either 19th century or 20th century minings. And now people will be able to look beyond the road and see the rehabilitated tailings pond, which for a quarter of a century was a terrible blight on the environment and caused great concern and great worry. And it now will be an example of what can be achieved, albeit an expensive example if we're going to spend over 10 million. So from the academic point of view, there's a great story here. There's for scholars who wish to come and examine the social history, the mining history, the environmental history of the place. So we have much to offer in that respect, and to ensure that many of the mistakes made in Silvermines won't be made again. And they won't be made again, because planning is as such now that Galmai and Lisheen, for instance, near Thurles, is producing the same ore really as Silvermines, but under much different conditions, with a 20-year gap in between the planning permission of the current day and the permission that never existed in the 1960s. Often, with regard to mining, you never say never, and sometimes the day after you close a mine is the day you begin drilling again for other ore. And this happened in the 1960s when a Canadian company directed their interests towards silver mines by the name of Mogul. And they started prospecting in this area, and extensive drilling took place here throughout early 1960s up to 1963, 4 and 5, etc. And it was found that there was a lot of ore in this area, lead of course, and zinc, because they always go together. In advance of opening any mine, you need to know a number of things. Firstly, you need to know where the ore is, how much of it is there, the quality of it as well as the quantity of it. And all of this is done by means of drilling, hundreds and hundreds of holes drilling around the mountainside, which was done in the early 60s, which was carried out by Mogul. And all of these then were analysed and catalogued and stored in what we call a core shed. And we have miles and miles and miles of core, so many miles that if you put all the core logs side by side, they would extend from Neenah to Tipperary town, about 30 miles or more. The biggest single ever mining development then commenced in the 1960s, when Mogul, with assistance from the loss-making Irish Lead and Zinc Company, who were obviously delighted with this new interest because they owned the land and had control over the area, they were able to acquire a 25% share. So that was the breakdown: 75% for the Canadian-based Mogul company, and 25% from, and again, Ted Russell became a director of Mogul. They decided to develop what would then be Europe's largest base metal mine in 1968, when it was officially opened by the then Taoiseach, Cork man Jack Lynch, who came here on the 11th of September 1968 and officially opened the mine, which was obviously a tremendous boost for the economy of the area. Firstly, it was the largest industry in North Tipperary, employing over 500 people with good employment, lucrative employment, and we have examples of people virtually trebling their wages overnight by going to work maybe 600 or 700 or 800 feet underground as a miner, having maybe come from the land or come from services or whatever, maybe the previous week. So that was highly exciting. Now, Mogul also invested, of course, in housing as well, and they built some houses in Neenah called Knight's Crescent. Knight coming from the word, the founder was a knight himself, so the estate was called after him, Knight's Crescent. And houses were built as well in Nina at Ballygraig to facilitate the workers. Strangely enough, there were no new houses built in Silvermines. Now, in the 1950s, 4 houses had been built here to accommodate the loss-making lead and zinc company, but they still remained the property of the Silvermines Lead and Zinc Company. But obviously a decision was made that they should build their houses in Nina, 5 miles away, which in retrospect was probably sensible. And they built nice quality houses with a touch of Canadian design at Knight's Crescent for, we call them the officials or the executives. And Ballygraig then was where Nina got its first house building under the NBA, National Building Association. And indicative of the time, of course, and indicative of the availability of oil at a low price, there were no chimneys on those houses and they were flat roofed. So they were really built from a very economic scale, I would think. And of course, the projection was that the mine would run for 14 years. And the projection proved to be exactly correct, because this is the nature of mining. They can project the amount of ore that's there, the amount of time it will take to extract it, where it is, and so forth. And all of that type of work is done in advance of the development itself, which is why development work of mining is very expensive. And the plant at Silvermines at that time cost $20 million, which in our money at that time was £8 million, which was absolutely phenomenal. So, as would be normal, a lot of land was acquired to accommodate the mine and to facilitate the miners and the development work. And of course, this obviously led to people being moved from their farms and so forth. After selling their farms or selling their land or whatever, they moved either to town or to other areas. And that is part of the history of mining, this dislocation, if you like. So the development obviously started amidst great excitement, and miners came here from all over Ireland, from Donegal to Ballingarry, where there were miners already in Tipperary, and of course in particular local, Nina and Silvermines itself. And they were mixed in terms of standard, in terms of qualifications, and in terms of expertise. Firstly, as happened even in the 13th century and throughout the 1600s and 1800s, there were foreign miners, not English this time, but Canadian. And they came with the necessary skills to get the mine underway. And of course, they were assisted then by local, perhaps farmers or people willing to work as clerical officers or whatever. But it was a win-win situation in terms of employment. It gave wonderful employment, sustained employment for over 14 years. And people worked shift work. And of course, when you're underground, you work on a bonus system as well. And a lot of people made good money out of it. During the 14 years in Silvermines, there was great quietness overground. You know, when the shifts would come in and people would go down in what they call the cage, go down in great numbers to work 500, 600 and 700 feet underground. The shaft in Silvermines was almost 1,000 feet and had 3 different levels. So there was a whole underground working throughout the day, and unknown, unseen, not communicating with anybody, but extracting precious ore at the same time, bringing it to the surface, putting it through the processing plant, extracting the concentrate and shifting it overseas. So it's a very specific, but it's a very traditional industry, but very an industry that calls for great planning and great skill, and it's not without being a bit dangerous either. There were 3 fatalities in Mogul between 1968 and 1982, sadly. And then they were producing large quantities of ore. They were mining 3,000 tons of ore daily, from which they extracted 400 tons of what we call concentrate. Now the concentrate is the finished commodity in terms of the mine, and it's then shipped to smelters around Europe. In our case, the ore was taken by rail because CIE in the 60s had developed and built a spur railway to accommodate the mining. That was part of the a spur from the Limerick-Neenah rail line. So that was exciting at a time when railway stations were closing all over the country. Here we had Silvermines village getting its own new spur. And so the ore was taken away, 400 tons each day, by carriages to Foynes, to the port of Foynes in County Limerick, where it was shipped out to the smelters in Germany and elsewhere. And that went on for 14 years, and it was highly successful. Then at the end of the 14 years, you see, the mine closed, and of course there was a terrible downturn then, and despondency and so forth. But traditionally, of course, looking back down the generations, that's the nature of mining. They got 14 years, that particular project. Now, it was highly successful in terms of money as well, and it was probably the most profitable mining development ever to take place in Silvermines. And of course there were great spin-offs in terms of employment and so forth, and many people made great use. In particular, I suppose farmers and smallish farmers made great use of the money, because they worked in the mine during the day and they were able to farm their farms and develop their farms as well. So it had a wonderful beneficial effect from an economic point of view. But the aftermath then, after closure of course, when the dust settled, and the dust didn't settle, people began to realize that there were problems, and there were environmental problems which were not very manifest during production. For one thing, the so-called tailings pond, which had been built to accommodate the waste of the mine, that was built at the start of the mine, a 50-acre site near Gortmore, had been used, if you like, to accommodate 50% of the waste, which is normal with lead and zinc mining, that you deposit 50% in a tailings pond and you backfill the other 50%. So consequently, over a period of 14 years, you had a great build-up of mining residue, which of course was highly toxic with the high lead content and so forth. And sadly, it was developed and deposited into a pond that didn't have any proper environmental control. In other words, there was no lining on it to prevent the seepage of polluted water and so forth. And it transpired, of course, that the area and the adjacent Kilma-Stuller River was heavily polluted. But the real problem came in the aftermath of mining, about a year after closure, when, because there was no liquid intake, the pond itself began to dry up, and the prevailing winds then of February and March began to blow, and it began to blow this dust around, which had capacity to penetrate into people's houses and attics and so forth. And it caused great concern and great annoyance and great sorrow and great worry to people, because firstly it's toxic dust, and secondly it seemed to be virtually impossible to control it. And thirdly, of course, by this stage the company Mogul had left the site, and they were no longer interested in, or apparently interested in, rectifying it. Because during production, nobody spoke out, or hardly anybody spoke out about the dangers of it, and nobody foresaw that in the short period after the closure that the mine would cause such trouble. But it did, and it caused serious trouble. And then the locals organised themselves, meetings were held, deputations were made, the local authority, to the mining companies and so forth, And that went on year after year after year. A small amount of remedial work was carried out by Mogul, now Enix, incidentally, who had assumed all the responsibility of the Mogul operation. But it was minimalist and it was ineffective, and the problem continued until 2007 or 2006, I think, when eventually, after continuous lobbying for nearly a quarter of a century, the Minister Noel Dempsey, agreed, as Minister for Natural Resources, he agreed to fund a major rehabilitation programme, which would cost over €10 million. And that was obviously great news for the locals. But it took a quarter of a century, really. So they put in place then a 4-year programme that would rehabilitate 6 chosen sites, the principal one being the 150-acre site at Gortmore. And that now, as we speak here, at the end of 2009, is approaching completion, and will rank as one of the great success rehabilitation projects ever carried out in Ireland. Indeed, it should be said that this is the only mining site, Silvermines, to receive funding from the government for a rehabilitation programme, because the environmental record of mining in Ireland was pretty dismal and very damning. And it's only until, even though we've had the Planning Act since 1963, the Silvermines mine opened in 1968 without any planning permission, without permission being sought or granted. So we have a bad record in those terms, and we are paying the price now with spending over €10 million on 6 different sites around the village. But when complete, it will give a new beginning really to the Silvermines area, because the tailings pond will be vegetated, and the other sites as well will be cleaned up. And this is good news. So it enables then the community to direct their attention towards things like heritage and tourism and so forth. In other words, it's a new beginning for an old location. And that's the mining. But also, side by side with the Mogul mine, is an open cast, or was an open cast mine operated by Magobar, and they developed an open mine in 1963, which ran for 30 years until 1993, extracting ore, and they were extracting barytes. Now, open cast mining, of course, by its nature, is very intrusive on the environment, because you extract an awful lot of soil and material, which you discarding well over 90% of it. So consequently, at the end of a 30-year period, you're left with 2 distinctive things. One is the great deposits of mining on the landscape itself up along the mountain, and 2 then, of course, the massive hole that results from having extracted mine for 30 years. So you're left with a 200-foot pond virtually, which is of virtually no use to anybody. So that closed then as well in about 1993, and that really concluded the mining episode of the 20th century, and mining hasn't occurred here since. But we are left with serious challenges now. Firstly, to complete the rehabilitation programme, and secondly, to seek out a new usage and a new beginning. But meanwhile, the great story and the great heritage of the area survives, and this is of special interest to students and to visitors and so forth. And that will enable us now to focus our attention on giving a better image for the area and making the area more attractive and so forth. A proposal outlining the development of the megabar site. Bear in mind now, this is a huge 200-foot deep hole extending in area to maybe 50 acres, which had been developed or resulted from the mining on the side of a mountain 600 feet above sea level. And people certainly got the idea that it would make an ideal site for a dump, a landfill if you wish. And this caused great concern within the parish, and people set about opposing it. So there was a great campaign was launched. A public meeting was held, as would be the normal, in the hall organised by the local parish priest, to formulate a campaign against the development of the landfill. Now, it was probably going to be one of the biggest landfills in Ireland, and it was proposed that it would, by year 7, be capable of taking 450,000 tonnes of waste per year. Now, when you consider that a normal county dump might take 30 or 40,000 tonnes of waste a year, you get an indication of the magnitude of the development. And it really caused a great concern, and people were very unhappy with it because it was just a kilometre from the village church. It seemed unnecessary. It seemed, certainly it was unwarranted from the locals' point of view, and most certainly it was unwelcome from the locals' point of view. But nevertheless, planning application was formulated. And of course, to develop a dump of that magnitude, or to develop any dump, you need two things. You need a license, number one, and you need planning permission for the structure. In Silvermines, there was a third dimension to it, to the planning application, in that you would also need a license to dewater or to empty the this huge pond. And that was the first application sent in by the environmental company who were proposing the development. And North Tipperary County Council granted permission to dewater the site, and obviously this gave great comfort to the developers, and it also kept the notion of the landfill alive. But the campaign itself opposing it was very massive, really, and very widespread. And on one occasion we had 1,500 people attending a public meeting in Nina when when people simply objected to it. There was also an additional aspect to it. We felt, or the local people felt anyhow, that it was above the norm in this respect. For centuries, the local people of Silvermines had accommodated miners and mining development, and some cases, as I've already outlined, extending to parting with their land and selling their land and so forth. And people felt a high sense of betrayal in that here now at the end of an era of intensive mining, underground mining, open cast mining rather, for 30 years, and across the road then underground mining for 14 years. And all of the environmental problems associated with that this proposal to develop what was termed locally as a super dump caused great annoyance and great opposition, and it caused great pain as well. But nevertheless, the campaign was fought on honourable grounds, and it was fought in the courts, and it was fought in the streets, and it was fought with all around, convincing the community through the media, etc. And eventually the local campaign was successful, and the EPA refused permission for its development, and it was not appealed by the developers. So after 3 years then they walked away from the idea. But the consequences of it would have been serious, because the proposal was to bring in the waste by rail and use the spur that was developed in 1963 to bring in the waste from maybe half of Munster or whatever, and take it by truck from the railway. So it was the reverse of what had happened for 14 years, if you understand, in that bringing all this waste to the original sidings of the mine, bringing it across the road and up the mountain to deposit it, and it was a terrible contradiction and would have been a terrible injustice to the community and to the environment as well. So that didn't happen, and it was a great source of relief for the local community. For years here, there was no real indication of the history of mining here. So, as by way of a Millennium Project, the Silvermines and District Development Association at that time, which was led by Pat Keane, who was chairman, applied to Shannon Development for a little bit of help to erect some kind of a monument that would indicate it was somebody suggested that we should mount a statue of a miner, and that's what happened. It was made and put together by people in Clonmel, and it's 8 foot tall. It was erected to coincide with the millennium, and adjacent to that then we have a nice illustration outlining the history of the place, and it's very identifiable now. And it's cause of great interest because people stop there to take photographs and that. The hope is that this area now will become an attractive area for mining enthusiasts. It's probably the richest mining heritage site in Ireland because it transcends several generations of mining. The evidence in particular of 19th century mining and of course 20th century mining, and the great story of mining and the history and heritage of mining is unfolded here. And of course, coupled with that then it's a rather an attractive area, the Silvermines Mountains, which is already part of the national walking route and part of the Slieve Phelim walking route as well, which is well branded by this stage. So now as well that the tailings pond will be rehabilitated and will stand as an example of what can be done, first example that we've had in Ireland of successful rehabilitation. So the future should be bright for Silvermines and for the area and for the community.